1831, Southampton County, Virginia. At the edge of a pine-dark swamp off Cabin Pond Road, the map thins to water and reeds. 6 men arrive in twos, speaking low, scanning the tree line, as if the law itself were hiding between cypress roots. The papers will later call what follows a disturbance. The truth long made unspeakable in polite rooms begins where official light rarely reaches a secret meeting on a spit of ground surrounded by black water and insects. A small fire ashot, turning a tin cup of apple brandy passed hand to hand. They wait for a preacher who reads signs in scripture and sky, and they whisper, logistics, routes, thresholds, who will knock first, what to do when doors won't open. A plan hardens like mud in sun. This is not a tale for spectacle. It is a study in pressure and choice. What the record calls random, the landscape calls inevitable. The disturbing part is not only what happened next. It is how long the groundwork had been laid and how quickly certain facts would be tucked away, as if memory could be redacted like a line of ink. Stay, and we will walk the footpaths and the paperwork, the sermons and the patrol logs, and open the file people still pretend not to see the beginning that turned a county's quiet into an alarm. If you're ready to open this erased first chapter, tell us where you're watching from and what you knew about 1831 Southampton before today. Was the swamp meeting new to you? Like, share, and subscribe so this beginning isn't buried again. Before dawn breaks, there is routine. Fields hum with cicadas. Smokestacks drift above kitchens. The courthouse green waits for errands and gossip. In this ordinary moves an enslaved preacher named Nat Turner, midwife, laborer, reader of verses trusted and feared at once. He reads the Bible aloud and the sky in silence. An eclipse earlier that year seemed to tilt the world by a degree. Some called it weather, he called it a final warning. Around him, enslaved and free black families calculate each day, like a ledger steps that can be taken without drawing a patrol's attention. Words safe to say where children won't repeat them in the wrong house. The system presents itself as order laws, sermons, mounted patrols, but the veneer is thin. Beneath it lies a macabre arithmetic, bodies priced movements, licensed voices managed. To those who profit from that arithmetic, a preacher with literacy and listeners is not a curiosity. He is a threat. Still, the ordinary keeps trying to reassert itself, bred to bake fences, to mend a hymn, to hum over wash water. And yet the swamp holds a counter rhythm, the sense that something rehearsed is about to be performed. Understand that tension, the public calm and the private countdown, and you understand why a meeting in a swamp could matter more than a speech on the courthouse steps. What follows is not superstition in motion. It is policy answering itself. The plan the county refuses to name did not start with a blade. It started with a decision to stop waiting for permission that would never come. Production note for editors: convey tension without graphic imagery. Use maps, documents, respectful recreations, contemporary landscapes, and archival headlines with sensitive elements blurred. The laws did not simply police bodies. They organized time, speech, and sight. In Southampton, the day was divided by bells and patrols. Sunrise tasks, noon counts, dusk, curfews, so regular that control could be mistaken for climate. Statutes conditioned the smallest gestures, who could travel, and with what pass, who could gather, and for how long, who could read, and who must pretend not to. Pulpits sanctified the order with carefully chosen verses. Newspapers lifted scattered rumors into policy. Magistrates compressed hearings into hours, recording guilt the way clerks total a ledger. If the revolt we are tracing is disturbing, it is because it answered an architecture, not an accident. The people who met at the swamp knew the shape of that architecture by feel the road bends where patrols prefer to ride. The miller's dog barks at unfamiliar feet. The night watch drinks from a particular jug at a particular porch. They did not misread their county. They mapped it. The social air itself was weaponized. Whisper and echo, spectacle and silence. When a child repeated an overheard sentence in the wrong kitchen, a mother learned again that language could be seized. When a man returned late from an errand, a patrol used the delay to revise him into an example. Those habits of power taught the courthouse to treat violence like a misunderstanding and any petition from the enslaved like insolence. In editorials, the word fanatic stood in for the complicated person who refused to break under the rules. In sermons, obedience was made to sound like protection. On paper, all of this looked like peace. In practice, it functioned as pressure a dial turned a click tighter each season. Economics sat behind it like a machine that must not be named. Cotton and corn accounts linked households to banks, sheriffs to auctioneers, credit lines to bodies listed without surnames. If a field failed, a person might be sold. If a debt came due, a family might be parted. The arithmetic produced its own theology, that order was natural deviation, dangerous, and any public correction of the ledger. Any attempt to alter who owed what to whom would be classified as chaos. In such a county, a preacher who achieved literacy, memory, and authority posed a contradiction the law did not know how to write down except as threat. The ordinary we met in the previous act, the bread and fences and hymns, rested on a surface tension that could not be admitted to the record. So when the Swamp Council formed, they were not inventing fury. They were replying to policy. They had watched trials end before testimony began. They had seen patrols ride like punctuation at the end of unwanted sentences. The system had already announced that their lives would be managed and their griefs erased. What they devised in the reeds was not the first violence of the story. It was a decision to answer a text written against them. And the county, which had practiced the art of not hearing, would soon perform the art of not remembering. Across those same years, the natural world began to look like a margin where one could write what could not be said aloud. Weather sky birds at unusual hours, none of this was superstition in the sense mocked by the editorial page. It was a code book born of necessity. The February eclipse was read as a paragraph from a larger book. Daylight dimmed to a rim, insects quieted, and men and women looked up with thoughts they could not safely share. To some it was astronomy, to others a signal that the sentence was about to turn. When illness delayed the July plan, the delay felt like a comma, the breath before a clause that would name names and open doors. And then the August light went strange, the sun wavering blue-green through high dust atmosphere and omen together. In that tint, the preacher saw a final warning. In that warning, the men gathered supplies, sharpened courage the way others sharpened steel. It mattered that these readings came from a preacher. Scripture in Southampton had been used like a fence, verses selected to shorten vision, to train the ear to hear duty and not deliverance. But the enslaved read too, with or without letters. They read the chords of narrative for escape routes. Exodus threaded through spirituals. Revelation hovered in storms, prophets' rhythms turned into daily resolve. The county could ban assemblies and limit who stood in a pulpit. It could not ban interpretation. The sky remained public, the swamp unindexed. Together they became a sanctuary and a study hall. If a comet could be catalogued, so could a patrol. If clouds could be tracked across a week, so could the habits of a magistrate. Knowledge grafted itself wherever it could take root. There were warnings beyond the sky. Dogs uneasy in courtyards where they normally slept. A door hinge that squealed at the wrong hour. A neighbor who suddenly grew generous with advice. Some people sensed a current under the calm and said so in ways that preserved deniability. Travel carefully. Mind the evening, sing softer tonight. Others, loyal to the arithmetic that fed them, gripped their routines harder. You can measure a community by how it handles omens, whether it treats them as weather or as information. The enslaved community treated them as both cloud and clue temperature and timetable. Hoodoo and prayer sat side by side without contradiction. A bag of roots worn near the heart for protection did not cancel the psalm sung at daybreak. The psalm did not cancel the root. In a world where the law had declared their bodies available and their futures provisional, people made layers of safety the way you layer blankets against a draft. If there was a blessing to be made over a doorway, it was made. If there was a verse that lent courage, it was memorized. This syncretic practice, African survivals, Christian scripture, local craft, was less an occult than an archive of methods for staying alive. Outsiders called it superstition because they mistook utility for credulity. The men at Cabin Pond called it preparation. Even those who scoffed at omens found themselves counting coincidences. A patrol's horse stumbling, a deputy's lantern failing, a rumor that the courthouse clerk's hand shook when he signed warrants that week. None of these facts changed the odds, but they indicated a pressure shift that can be felt in human weather as surely as in the skies. A county that had long relied on fear to keep its ledgers straight now faced a kind of fear it could not name without indicting itself. Fear that the words it had used to hold others in place might lose their power. Meanwhile, the language of the powerful arranged a stage set for what would come after. Editors rehearsed phrases, fanatics, deluded barbarous, to deploy at speed when the first reports arrived. Preachers had sermons half-written about obedience. Magistrates reviewed emergency procedures for disturbance. It is not prophecy to say they were ready. It is bureaucracy. The script that would make the swamp meeting sound like a fever dream was already drafted. The archive, when it came, would preserve order by trimming meaning. The banned parts, the calculations, the prayers, the slow, careful reading of sky and law would be treated as noise. If you listen to the wind in the pines at Cabin Pond, you can still hear the counterscript taking shape. It does not shout. It lists. How far between houses? Which doors open toward the road? Where the iron tools are hung? How many minutes it takes a rider to reach the next bend? Faith and logistics share a page. The preacher's vision names the day. The map names the turns. The county believes it has sealed off every avenue of agency, but the marsh does what marshes do. It joins waters the surveyors meant to keep apart. Messages move along those hidden channels. What looks like stillness is a network. By the time night folded into the first morning, the plan had the one quality the law could not repeal: consensus among those who would carry it. You can outlaw meetings. You cannot outlaw agreement once it is formed. That is why the county tried later to erase the origin. It is less frightening to imagine frenzy than to face deliberation. Frenzy can be dismissed. Deliberation demands accounting. So when we follow the men stepping off the island, we are following more than footsteps. We are following a long argument with power spoken in two languages. At once the legalese of a county that declared itself permanent and the liturgy of a people who knew better. Production note for editors: emphasize statutes maps and sky plates over reenactments. Animate timelines of slave codes. When referencing omens or hoodoo, present respectfully as cultural practice rather than spectacle. Avoid graphic visuals at all times. Dawn loosens into heat and the swamp exhales them. Boots, wet clothes carrying the scent of pine and smoke. The first door they approach is not a symbol. It is a calculation. Who is home at that hour which latch sticks where the dogs sleep? At each house the plan meets the unplannable, a shutter that will not swing a floorboard, that groans a voice behind a wall saying a name they had hoped not to hear. The county will later insist on frenzy. What happens in these first minutes is procedure: knock entry search for firearms, attempts to prevent alarms from traveling faster than they do. They take what they can carry: a musket here, a blade there, powder and ball, a horse whose owner now stares at a morning he did not expect to see. Their route is toward Jerusalem, the seat of that tidy ledger which has never had room for their losses. The goal is as much momentum as miles convince the county that the old arithmetic has stopped adding up. Word moves in curved lines. A rider spotted on a distant road becomes a rumor, in the next kitchen then a certainty that leaps 2 miles by midday. Some houses yield weapons with hardly a word. At others, voices crack into shouts and prayers. There are moments of mercy, and there are moments where the heat of years condenses into a choice made too quickly and regretted too late. We avoid the lurid because it tells you nothing new. The important thing is what the county does next. Militiamen are summoned by horn and messenger. The courthouse wakes papers dusted from a shelf. Keys found a clerk drafting a call for aid that describes events in the only language he knows: disorder requiring discipline. In that language, the men from the swamp are already guilty in a way no testimony can repair. By mid-morning, they are joined by some who had doubted the week before and now see that the window is open. Numbers grow, then thin, then grow again as some peel off to check on families or to escort those who are suddenly targets for retaliation. The road toward Jerusalem is not a straight sprint. It is a chain of contact points where they hope to replenish courage and powder. Some enslaved people refuse to join, not from cowardice but calculation. Not a single mind in Southampton is untouched by fear, and fear makes many shapes. The newspapers will flatten all those shapes into a single silhouette later. For now, we track a group moving through fields and yard lines, singing once, then falling to silence when they sight a lane where dust hangs too long, as if hoofbeats had recently passed. The first armed opposition stiffens near a crossroads where the shade gathers under oaks. A handful of men with experience in patrol work carry themselves with the confidence of habit. Shots are traded, chaotic, but not senseless. There is a recoil of surprise in both directions, the rebels at how quickly a county can raise its hand, the militia at how many have chosen to disobey. No battle lasts long in these spaces. Engagements are brief, loud, and then drowned by the hum of insects returning. The group retreats not in collapse, but in dispersal, the swamp and woodlots offering 1,000 temporary doors they can slip through. What had begun as a straight intention toward the courthouse becomes a pattern of thrust and fold, like a map creasing itself. By late day, the county has remembered its machinery. Couriers ride to neighboring jurisdictions. A company from a distance is promised if the sheriff can hold until evening. A minister stands on the courthouse steps and prays, voice shaking, in the way of men who discover that their theology has always assumed the world would remain aligned with their ledger. In houses across the county, those who sympathize with the revolt, without daring to say so, begin to hide what little they can: a notebook, a keepsake, a name. Others who see their power threatened grip long guns and rehearse their speeches for the next day's gathering, when it will be time to explain to one another how such a thing could have happened. With the sun leaning west, the group that left the swamp becomes several threads, each pulled by a choice fight flee. Regather or vanish back into the marsh. It is here that betrayal by structure becomes most visible. A patrol that once ignored certain crimes now rides with sanctimony. A magistrate who once dismissed pleas now writes warrants so swiftly his ink splashes like rain. The men from Cabin Pond will be described as inhuman to make the human calculus of the county palatable property, defended order restored. Yet amid this rush to order, we hear other voices. A woman on a porch screaming not in anger but grief. A child who will not stop crying because the world no longer maps. An old man saying quietly that he has waited his whole life to feel the air change, even if it brings danger with it. Those voices will not be quoted in depositions. They are what disappear when history is compiled in concise paragraphs. Night reasserts its claim, and the swamp reclaims its people. The island that had served as council chamber becomes a hospital, a hiding place, a refuge for plans reduced but not destroyed. Some men are captured in barns where they slept too heavily, or in thickets where their tracks betrayed them. Others navigate by familiar constellations, taking routes used by runaways for generations low ground. Where sound travels oddly fence lines, no patrol horse will jump at night. A few make for the Great Dismal's edges, a geography where the county's authority has always felt thinner. Turner himself, elusive as a thought one tries not to think will survive now by the same skills that made his sermons Potent patience, quiet attention to the small changes in air and sound that tell you who is near. What follows in the days after is the courthouse's turn to perform. Committees of alarm, mounted patrols, circulars sent to editors who will gladly convert panic into policy. Some people are seized on suspicion alone. Others are turned in by those who hope to purchase their own safety with a neighbor's name. Trials are scheduled quickly and conducted more quickly. Confessions will be recorded in a tone that makes them sound both inevitable and confirming. The record appears to speak when, in fact, it is the clerk who speaks through it. The archive gathers power from its posture of calm. We note this carefully. What looks like reason is often a second performance of fear. Meanwhile, stories blink into and out of existence. A field hand claims to have seen a group pass at dawn, singing a verse not heard in church. By dusk, that memory has become a caution not to sing at all. A boy tells of a wagon that carried 2 bodies that were never counted. By the time he is old enough to tell it again, the people he would tell it to have learned not to ask for numbers after an event the county labels closed. A nurse whispers that the militia spared a particular house because the owner was useful in other matters. No one writes that down where a descendant can find it. These are the materials of what we call the banned testimony. The parts erased not by flames, but by the steady air of official neglect. There is in a shed behind a plantation house a ledger with pages torn out. It may be the overseer's journal we have heard of, or merely a coincidence of absence. The gap is tempting and dangerous. We must not fill it with fiction to soothe our need. But we can say what gaps do they act like, doors you cannot open, and so you stand outside and infer. Across many counties in many years, ledgers lose their most difficult days. It is easier to preserve a record of deliveries and repairs than an account of who was punished and why. Where the ink fails us, we turn to patterns: the sudden sale south of a dozen people after a revolt, the spike in patrol budgets, a burst of laws about assembly and preaching. The shape of the aftermath is legible even when individual lines have been cut. Turner is eventually captured not in a blaze, but in the small, ordinary mechanisms of a county that had recovered its rhythm. He is brought to the courthouse and questioned. The text we have carefully circulated and long debated speaks in 2 registers at once: the specific answers of a man with nothing left to bargain, and the quiet edits of a recorder who understands what a public requires to feel whole again. We do not need to adjudicate every sentence here to understand the gravity the county seeks to narrate itself back into innocence, and the words of the man it will soon execute are part of that project. When he speaks of signs, they record superstition. When he speaks of policy and grievance, they record threat. Executions follow in a cadence designed to reassure. We will not dwell on details. What matters is that the state does what it has practiced. It converts fear into ritual, and ritual into proof that the world is righted. Families watch the horizon and measure who has not returned. In some kitchens, heads are shaved and names whispered in mourning. In others, toasts are raised to order with that particular cheerfulness that attends the avoidance of thought. The arithmetic of property resumes, as if a storm had merely shaken the shutters. Yet even as the county congratulates itself, something exhibits fracture. A magistrate wakes at night to the sound of frogs and cannot keep from hearing footsteps in the pattern. A patrol leader finds his hand trembles when he pours coffee. Parents note that their children ask too many questions about the sky. The revolt has been physically contained. The premise remains at large. Containment now requires a new layer of control: stricter statutes on reading gatherings, further limited sermons, more closely watched. The county, having failed to prevent one meeting in a swamp, declares that no such meeting will ever happen again. It is a declaration against geography and against memory both. We leave this act not with a drum roll, but with paper. Warrants, depositions, editorials, statutes. Each a piece of language turned mechanical. The official count calcifies in columns, its certainty comforting to those who need the past to be tidy. The unofficial count persists in families and songs that shift a line to hide a name in the absence of men and women at tables where they once sat. Both counts are real in their own way. Only one is invited to the courthouse archive. That is why the origin matters. If we forget the island where the plan was agreed, then we forget that a society can make disobedience rational. If we forget the voices that do not appear in minutes of meetings, then we consent to a future where only the winners of paperwork are allowed to be human. Production note for editors. Stage the march through documents, maps, and respectful location footage. When depicting confrontations, imply stakes with sound design and pacing rather than visuals. For the courthouse sequence, emphasize pens, seals, and the stacking of papers. Avoid graphic imagery at all times. The county story hardens first in numbers. A printed toll appears in columns tidy as fence posts, reassuring to those who need calamity to look like arithmetic. But numbers are never neutral in a panic. Some names never make it to ink. Some bodies are buried before a clerk can spell them. Some disappear into sales recorded later as routine. The divergence, the official count versus the count, the living remember, opens like a seam. And through that seam we glimpse the macabre machinery of order returning. Warrants are signed in handfuls, hearing rooms fill and empty in the space of an hour. And the rope becomes a device for restoring the fiction that violence is an interruption rather than a rule. We keep the lens respectful. We avoid gore because spectacle lies. The gruesome truth is administrative signatures stacked higher than testimony confessions, captured in a tone that makes them sound both inevitable and confirming circulars to editors pre-written for the moment, when a sheriff needs a headline to sound like closure. Retaliation spreads beyond the path the men from Cabin Pond actually walked. People who did not lift a hand are seized as examples. Families are broken by sale in the name of security. The courthouse calls this the restoration of peace. The ground calls it a harvest of fear. There are artifacts that do not look like evidence until you learn to read them. A ledger with missing pages where the month's punishment should be. A church register that suddenly lists fewer communicants. A patrol budget that jumps threefold after order is declared restored. Behind a plantation house, a shed that smells of paper, even with its door shut. Whether or not the overseer's journal exists, as rumor claims. The pattern is undeniable. The archive preserves what flatters power and forgets what would force it to account. Why then does the narrative always return to superstition, to the eclipse, and the blue-green sun? Because economies prefer a mystical culprit to a policy one. If you can say, it was frenzy, you never have to say, it was grievance. If you can say, it was delusion, you never have to say, it was design. Editors reach for the same handful of words, fanatic, barbarous, because those words convert a deliberate argument with the law into noise that the law is permitted to silence. Preachers condemn a theology they never had to live under. Magistrates tighten statutes not to prevent chaos, but to prevent explanation. The mechanics of erasure are boring by intent. Burn a few papers, misplace a few more, reduce a deposition to a line, promote a rumor that makes compassion sound dangerous. The most disturbing revelation is not found in a ditch or on a scaffold. It is found in the cool tone of the record after. Order restored. Guilty as charged. Examples made. Read closely, and you can see the county narrating itself back to innocence, stitching the tear with wording so calm it feels like weather. Yet the tear shows. A patrol leader's hand shakes when he pours coffee. A magistrate avoids the West Road at dusk. Mothers hush children when the sky changes color, as if the heavens might again annotate the day. The revolt is contained. The premise persists. A people once declared property have made deliberation visible. Containment now requires a thicker silence. So the swamp becomes myth, the meeting becomes rumor, and the grievances are filed under aberration. We arrive finally at the bleak balance sheet. The official total sits on one page. The community's unprinted names breathe in kitchens and fields. The state has proven it can kill and call it law. The survivors prove simply by continuing that law without justice is only technique. What the county most needs us to forget is the origin's rationality, a plan made in low voices with maps and scripture and sky not a fever dream. What the county most needs us to accept is that the paperwork is the truth. Our task in telling is to hold both the care with which the men approached the first door and the carelessness with which the state approached the first trial. If the swamp kept any secret, it was this deliberation can live where the surveyors never planned for it. The island taught men to think beyond the ledger's edges. That is why erasure focuses there on the beginning. Bury the meeting, and you bury the argument. Leave only the shock, and you never have to answer the question that follows shock. Why did an entire architecture make revolt seem logical? Until that question is allowed into the record, the land will go on being haunted not by ghosts, but by omissions. Production note for editors: emphasize administrative process over reenactment. Close shots of pens, seals, ledger gaps, and headline layouts. Contrast official count versus community memory with animated infographics. Maintain respectful distance from violence. No graphic imagery at any time. By daylight, the county looks ordinary again. Fields, trimmed porches swept the courthouse clock, refusing to admit what time once held. But ordinary is only the surface. The land remembers in quiet ways a ditch that was widened for no good reason, a page in a family Bible where a name stops a hymn that changes a line and never tells you why. The official story says order returned. The lived story says a question never closed. What haunts is not spectacle but omission. The numbers in print do not match the names in kitchens. The statutes still carry the shape of fear. And somewhere between Cabin Pond and the courthouse ledger lies the missing bridge, the part that explains why a meeting in a swamp could feel more lawful than the law. If history is a record of decisions, then forgetting is one more decision. We can leave the file shut and call it peace, or open it and call it work. So I'm asking you to help widen the record. If you're watching from Virginia or anywhere a ledger outlived a life, what did your town teach or skip about 1831? Did you ever hear of the swamp meeting before this? If your family keeps a story that never made it to print, share the shape of it below. What should be remembered that a clerk could not or would not write down? Add your city and what surprised you most. If you believe the land is still haunted by omissions, say why. Like and subscribe if you want more investigations that replace rumor with record, and if there's a marker near you that tells only half the tale, tell us where to look next. The file doesn't close here. It opens where you are.